Welcome back. I'm Tedward, and today, thanks to Bond Group in Waltham, Massachusetts, we're driving a 2005 Aston Martin DB9. This is a pretty early DB9 since the first model year was 2004, and it stretched to 2016, meaning that this has a 5.9-liter naturally aspirated V12, the AM11 engine, and it's based on the VH1 platform, which means Ford helped build this in order to make a more sustainable car company that could be stretched and widened for all different purposes, and that's where we end up with DBS and Virage and Rapide, Vantage, all of the things that ended up being built on the VH platform. Now, this being a pre-facelift vehicle, it has 450 horsepower and a 6-speed torque converter automatic Touchtronic transmission. It could be optioned in a 6-speed manual, but very few were. And today I think I'm going to make a case in favor of this transmission. Why not challenge myself a little bit? This one's jet black, and it's got a falcon gray interior, which actually looks very similar to the interior in my M3. It's like a grayish blue, and we've got this gorgeous wood veneer, which I assume may be walnut or something. I don't know. I'm not fancy enough for this, but this is probably the cheapest way to get yourself into a V12. You're looking at somewhere in the $50,000 range. Depreciation, ooh, it's a little painful on the Aston Martin market because brand new, the MSRP on one of these would have been $155,000. Down here, the carpet, we have this very risky, bold choice. It's a deep pile plush white wool floor mat. And I can only imagine how many dates would go sour when you say, you know what, you're gonna have to take your shoes off when you get into my car. These seats are surprisingly comfortable, although the early cars did not have the most outrageous design for the seats. So they look a little blank in here, which is so odd, but I find them really charming. And yes, this is a 2+2, but the early cars on these seats, the release switch to move this seat forward is in a very inconvenient location. Later on, they put it up here, which I find so much easier to access. But although, yes, 2+2, more for stuff or a legless child to sit in the rear of the vehicle. But one stylish feature that I find interesting about the DB9 is that on the front seats, our seatbelts extend from the outside in, where in the rears, they extend from the inside out. But let's jump under the hood, because I think this is probably the reason you're buying a DB9 on the secondhand market. Under here, we have our AM11. It's labeled as a 6-liter V12. We all know that to be an untruth. I don't think it's a lie, but it's a 5.9-liter V12. And it's a very handsome engine. It is a proper front engine vehicle. It's not set behind the front axles. But up here, I do find this really interesting because we always get our hand-built in England plaque with our final inspection, this one by Paul Goddard. Thank you, Paul. But I have never seen this before. On the early cars, apparently they left email addresses on this plaque. It says DB9 at astonmartin.com and engines at astonmartin.com. I wonder what would happen if you sent messages to them there today. Everyone likes to grumble that these were the Ford years, but you know what? I think this is a really classic design for a car. The shape is iconic, it's fantastic. And even these headlights, maybe if those are Ford reminiscent, that's not such a bad thing, because to me, I look at that and I see Ford GT in those headlights. Up here, we've got 245 section fronts, 285 section rears to hold this about 3,800 pound vehicle on the road. And that's the thing, although it is a sporty car, it's certainly not a sports car. It's a Grand Tourer. And that means we've got loads of room in the boot. Back here for, of course, a battery tender, our Aston Martin umbrella, and our smart tire warning system, because these were the early days of TPMS, and that's actually how you would tell whether or not you were in trouble. So maybe not the most helpful thing in the world, since it's behind you in a trunk rather than on your dashboard. Now, those of you who know Aston Martin inside out might be saying, this is the wrong deck lid for a North American 2005 DB9. It's actually a Euro deck lid, so it doesn't have those protruding bumperettes, and that is much more stylish. In fact, this owner upgraded the taillights to these clear taillights, the wheels, so that's a later model wheel, and it has DBS front and rear sway bars, so it handles quite a bit nicer. But let me start this up for you. You gotta hear this thing jump to life. It's fantastic. Again, interior very different than later models. We actually have a key that is not the ECU, the emotion control unit, which in later models pops into the dashboard. On this model, we've got a key on the column. So we go in here, turn this to our start position, and then we can hold our push to start button here. Pretty ferocious sound out of this V12. We should probably listen to the idle back here because this is fantastic. Now down here we've got a little cubby for, I guess, the foresight of the iPhone. Not quite the right size, but that's all right. And our old school Aston setup with the twirly knobs. Now I believe the owner even upgraded the knobs in the vehicle because obviously that's a touch point you're at all the time. But you can tell with our very old and dated infotainment system, you know, this is not ideal, but you could make do, and it's kind of just charming to have this. But at the end of the day, you're paying far less than $100,000 for a V12. Let's not be beggars. Down here we've got our park distance control, our defroster, our sport mode, and our traction control. So we've got a foot on the brake, we'll pop it into drive, and then we can release our emergency brake or our hand brake, our parking brake, whatever you'd like to call it, by lifting up, pressing the button, and pushing down. So that way it's always in the down position whether it's engaged or not. Pretty long gearing. I'm pretty impressed with that, actually. I mean, it goes to show that this was designed to get you from one part of Europe to another in style, comfort, and without any hesitation to pass when you got a small gap. You've got plenty of torque to get the job done, especially around slow econo cars. And out here on the highway is where it belongs. It wants to run, it wants to go. We've got the classic anti-clockwise tachometer, so that way speedo and tach are approaching each other on the dials with those needles. Some people hate that. I find it kind of charming. I don't really mind it. But here's the thing, you could get this in a 6-speed manual. And while that's great, I am not a big fan, actually, of manual Aston Martins. Not because I don't like to roll my own gears, but because Aston Martin always had very strange throttle tuning, and I always felt like the connection between driver and car in this sort of generation of Aston manuals was not great. You had to be really patient. You know, in the Vantage manual of the DBS, you've got to pull out of that throttle quite early and then clutch in, then go for it. Otherwise, you're revving it up. It's kind of an odd thing, and maybe you have to drive one to know. Maybe I'm just persnickety in particular, but I've got to say, I do feel like a torque converter automatic fits this DB9 just fine. What I like about this car is you just don't have to put very much effort into driving it because you've got low down torque. You can pretty much get away with driving this car under 3,000 RPM at all times if you so chose to do it. But when you do decide to open the taps a little bit, it's got all this grunt. You've got a nice progressive linear power band that climbs through the rev range. The Touchtronic paddle shifters. They're not the most responsive things in the world, but it allows you to hold your gear from some spirited driving. Just like current Aston Martins, if you want to go back into auto mode, just hit your drive button on the dashboard. Interesting that that layout never changed. It's still the same today. I do find that there's a surprising amount of cabin noise for a car that weighs nearly 4,000 pounds, cost $155,000 new, and is a bespoke Aston Martin. You know, this was a time when Aston was trying to sell a lot of cars. I mean, I know that sounds silly. Of course you want to sell a lot of cars, but this was supposed to be kind of a heavy hitter for them. The DB9 was their chance to, you know, really change the reputation of the company and almost do what everyone's doing today where they're introducing SUVs into the mix. This was an accessible car that I think they wanted to build a lot of. What's nice too is that when you have a car that spans a 12-year life cycle, you can get away with the older models because they don't really look old. If you upgrade the taillights and some little things here and there, you've basically got an up-to-date, classy, refreshed car. V12 has such a very characteristic rasp to it, and that's really interesting because I think a lot of folks, when they think V12s, they're always thinking Ferrari, Lamborghini, shrieking high-pitched wails, but that's not the case in the Aston Martin. It's definitely more of a torque monster where it's letting you know that it's got all of this low-down grunt, and when you're going to wind it out, you know, it's a British V12. This is not an Italian V12. Driving it down some normal roads reveals the quality of the ride, and I must say, this is a fairly stiff car, and I don't mean just because it has a fairly rigid chassis, but I believe that the struts and damper combination that they use on this, it makes it very stiff to a point where you recognize every imperfection in the road. Now, it's not an issue because you're buying a sporty Grand Touring car, but by today's standards, I feel like people would think this is infiltrating the cabin just a little too much for a luxury car. So it's interesting to go back to 2005 and kind of feel what a luxurious car like this Aston Martin would have felt like. So the DB9 is the successor to the DB7. So what happened to the DB8? Well, naming the car DB8 could have confused folks into thinking that this was only a mere 8-cylinder power plant. So in an effort to avoid any type of miscommunication, they called it a DB9. And this truly is a luxurious, classy car. You feel like a gentleman driving it. Everybody looks at it because they're kind of wondering, like, who's driving this thing? You know, I don't know very many folks who own Aston Martins other than collectors. And, you know, to daily drive or have this as your occasional weekend car does not mean that you're out annihilating on-ramps and off-ramps and doing 160-mile-an-hour pulls. It means that you're just enjoying the sheer character of a lovely car. This is one of the few examples of like great motoring. Sometimes motoring isn't about spreadsheets and times, it's just about experience and feel, and this car really is a joy to drive. I do find the seating position to be fantastic. I'm nice and low in the cabin. I've got all kinds of visibility, even though we've got the intense rake of this angle on the windshield. You know, it's not quite a Huracan, but, you know, the fact that I'm so low in the car, I'm not noticing really any impeded visibility. And I'm surrounded by luxurious materials. I've got Alcantara on the headliner. I've got leather in my hands, leather everywhere really, wood trim, shag carpet, deep pile, plush wool carpeting. It's just a great place to be. So if you're looking for a classy V12 that doesn't blend into societal traffic, it stands out just enough to make sure people know that you're handsome but not ostentatious, try out the DB9. Try out an old, early DB9. These are really fun. So thank you so much to Bond Group in Waltham, Massachusetts. Thank you guys so much for watching, liking, commenting, and subscribing. Don't you forget to respect the drive, and I'll see you in the next one. while this thing handles just fine, you definitely notice the heft. And the one thing that maybe gives it a little less confidence are the brakes. Now, the brakes work if you get into them really deep, but there's not like a beefy initial bite to them. What's nice about this big V12 is just that all this grunt comes in so low. You've got torque pretty much everywhere, which is what makes it a very lazy kind of driver. You can just kind of putt around. You don't need high crazy revs.